Hey everybody, welcome back to our video. So today I want to talk about the book Kennedy and the Promise of the Sixties. So this book is a really good book to read to get an introduction to the 1960s. It really covers this transition period between the 1950s and the 1960s because it's very much debated about when the 60s began. Philosophically speaking, when was the start of the 60s? And I think the pretty general consensus is that the 60s began after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963. So 1963 into 1964 is kind of seen as the starting point of, culturally speaking, the 1960s. So this time period between when Kennedy first ran for president in 1960 up until 1963 is this transition period where the 50s kind of merged into the 1960s, and you kind of saw the birth of the 1960s during this time period. But this book is not really, I wouldn't call it a study of Kennedy's presidency per se. It doesn't really look at his presidency. It just more looks at the cultural changes that were going on in America during this time period. I mean, it goes through all of the major events in Kennedy's presidency, but it's much more looking at this transition period culturally in America between the 1950s and the 1960s. And this book starts by looking at Kennedy's campaign for president. It talks about how Kennedy was really seen as the first celebrity president in the United States. He really changed the image of the presidency more than any other president before him because he was a very young president, and America was really shifting to being a much younger country. After the baby boom, there were so many young people in America. I think Kennedy really represents that shift that was happening in America during this time period. And Kennedy was also the first televised president. There was this debate that Kennedy had with Nixon where the debate was held on TV. People who saw the debate on television, the general consensus was that Kennedy had won this debate. And this debate was also held on the radio. And people who heard the debate on the radio, the general consensus was that Nixon had won the debate. So it just shows how powerful television was in being able to see the candidate. Having this young, attractive candidate on TV versus Nixon, who wasn't as good looking as Kennedy, just shows how powerful it was to be able to see who was running for president. So America was becoming a much more younger country, and television was really starting to take off during this time period. So it was a perfect storm that just really helped Kennedy win the presidency during this time period. And this author is very critical of Kennedy's presidency, especially when it comes to foreign policy and the Cold War, because Kennedy's presidency was marked by a lot of failures when it came to the Cold War. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was this Vienna summit that Kennedy had with Khrushchev that was just a complete failure. It made the U.S. look very weak, and the USSR really came out on top after that summit. Then there was that Laos issue where the country Laos it was agreed that it would be an independent country, and it wasn't something that was going to fall under U.S. influence or wasn't going to be divided up in the way that Korea or Vietnam was. So it was really seen as a failure because there was still a lot of communist influence in Laos, yet it was determined that it was an independent, non-aligned nation when it came to this developing Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR. And also, I think one of the biggest failures that was seen during Kennedy's presidency when it came to the Cold War was the Berlin Wall. Because when the Berlin Wall went up, it was really seen as the U.S. losing when it came to that whole crisis because West Berlin was walled in by the Soviets. So the fact that Kennedy wasn't able to stop that from happening really came off as being a failure when it happened. And the Berlin Wall is a very odd thing to learn about, because when I first started reading history and learning about history, the Berlin Wall always seemed like a very weird thing. It was this random little enclave within the Soviet sphere of influence, within the Soviet bloc. It just seemed very odd. Aesthetically, it just looks very off when you look at a map during Cold War in Europe. But it really was a very important reason for the U.S. to stay there, because when Germany was defeated during World War II, Berlin was this very central location in Germany, and it really needed to be controlled by all the Allied powers. And it was really a good idea to have Berlin divided up, because Germany wasn't meant to be divided into East Germany and West Germany. It was meant to be this place that was just split up in different occupation zones by the Allied powers, and Berlin was the central place where all the Allied powers could have a seat at the table in Berlin. Very quickly, that didn't really work out. You had East Berlin, or East Germany and West Germany. So if the U.S. pulled out of West Berlin, it would have made us look very weak. And the Soviets were always trying to get us out of West Berlin. There was the whole Berlin airlift where the Soviets cut off all these roads that were going to Berlin, where the U.S. and the Allies were sending supplies to West Berlin, so they had to airlift supplies into the Berlin Wall. They're really just trying to choke off West Berlin and have it be part of the Soviet sphere of influence in East Germany. And pulling out of that would have made the US look very weak. So that's why Kennedy needed to stay in Berlin. And like I said before, the Berlin Wall was initially seen as a failure for the Kennedy presidency. But I think in the long run, the Berlin Wall really became a symbol of the failure of communism because it was keeping people from getting into East Berlin. People wanted to get out of East Germany and get into West Germany. So it really represents, I think, the failures of communism, how it was keeping people in. It wasn't so much about keeping people from West Berlin in West Berlin. It was about keeping East Berliners and East Germans from getting in there to get out of the Soviet bloc. So there were quite a few failures during Kennedy's early presidency. And I think the one turning point for him was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The fact that we didn't have a nuclear war when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think is really a testament to Kennedy's job of stopping that from happening. And Kennedy really needed to stand up to the Soviets at this time because after all the failures very early in his presidency, he needed to stand up and show that he was tough against the communists. And the fact that the Soviets put missiles in Cuba, it really didn't add anything militarily to the Soviets' ability to launch missiles at the U.S. because they had submarines all in the Atlantic Ocean. They could have easily launched missiles into the U.S. and could have gotten even closer than Cuba was. But it was much more symbolic having these missiles in Cuba. And it was much more, I think, a domestic issue that Kennedy needed to prove to the American people that he was going to stand up to the Soviets and not back down. And I think Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, most people are familiar with what the Cuban Missile Crisis was, but I think most people don't realize how high stakes it was. The Cuban Missile Crisis really brought us closer to nuclear war, and I think most people want to admit, because the Soviets, the Americans weren't really aware of how much infrastructure the Soviets had put in Cuba. There were 43,000 Soviet soldiers in Cuba. And at the time, U.S. intelligence thought that there was around 4,000 soldiers. So they very much underestimated how much military power the Soviets had in Cuba. And the Soviets also had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. So if the U.S. decided to bomb these missile sites or invade Cuba, it would have quickly turned into a very major conflict. And the Soviets would have almost certainly used tactical nuclear weapons to defend their missile sites in Cuba. So it was a very high stakes event during the Cold War. And coming out of that, Kennedy was just seen as a much more confident president. He really proved that he could stand up to the Soviets. And I think that really was the turning point in Kennedy's presidency. And after you see Kennedy becoming this much more confident president following the Cuban Missile Crisis, you definitely see him standing up a lot more when it came to international affairs in the Cold War. I think one event in particular really highlights this change in Kennedy is in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese president at the time, Ngo Dinh Diem, became much more of a liability to the United States in its interests in South Vietnam. And Kennedy signed off on this coup that took place where a group of South Vietnamese generals overthrew Ngo Dinh Diem, and he was assassinated. And Kennedy didn't so much sign off on him being assassinated, but he did sign off on this coup taking place, and the U.S. was going to stand back and let whatever happened. So the fact that we just stood back and, I think it was pretty obvious that he was going to be assassinated, but Kennedy decided just to stand back and let that happen. And you definitely see, I think, him using the CIA a lot more to really push U.S. interests abroad during the Cold War. And it wasn't just things happening in South Vietnam. He definitely used the CIA a lot more around the world, especially the CIA was really trying to look for a way to assassinate Castro. Kennedy was actively working with the CIA to find a way to assassinate Castro. Up until really the day Kennedy himself was assassinated, he was still working with the CIA to try to find a way to kill Castro. And the assassination of the South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, that happened in November 2nd, 1963. So this is days before Kennedy himself was shot, which I think is just kind of symbolic in a strange way, or just kind of a weird coincidence that happened in such a close proximity time-wise. There's a lot of debate and speculation about the possible connection between those two things, but I'm not getting into that in this video. But yeah, it definitely see how Kennedy started off very weak very early on in his presidency when it came to the Cold War and foreign policy, and he became much tougher over time up until he himself was assassinated in 1963. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was really an event that really changed America. Because I think it really scared Americans. It showed us how close we had come to nuclear war. And it really showed us how pointless this whole arms race was. It just really I think, made Americans wake up and just see the real dangers of nuclear weapons. And in this realization that Americans had during this time period, this is where you see the start of peace activism. This is where the peace activists really start to come out and start protesting war and the arms race that was going on. And this peace activism is really the start of the New Left, because the New Left that emerged during the 1960s, peace activism was such a central part in all these protests that we saw in the United States during this time period. And this time period saw the birth of the New Left, but it also saw the birth of the New Right, because coming out of the 1950s and into the 1960s, this was the age of McCarthyism. This is the era when the government was trying to root out communists in America. You also had figures like J. Edgar Hoover and William F. Buckley, and all these people who you think of as figures in the emergence of modern conservatism in America really all have their roots during this time period. So you see how America was really starting to be divided during this time period. You had the New Right and the New Left emerging at pretty much the same time. And this is when you had the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, was emerging in the early 1960s. And the conservatives had their own version of that. They had Young Americans for Freedom, which was basically the conservative version of Students for a Democratic Society. So you see how young people were becoming much more politically active on both sides. And this is really, I think, really where the New Right and the New Left had their birth. And I think that 1960s really, this divide that was forming in America really represents this point where culture in America was being overtaken by counterculture. I don't mean counterculture as just the hippies. I mean counterculture, this broader counterculture that was emerging that included activism and civil rights movement and hippies and just changing values and norms in America. Because 1950s was really about kind of trying to go back to our roots and just kind of stamp down on people being different and just a lot of conformity. And it was about traditional American values, and it was kind of about just having this traditional America, and this dominant culture was the 1950s that you think of when you think of the 1950s. And during the early 1960s, you see this counterculture emerging, this counter narrative to these traditional American values. And the 60s really represent a transition that occurred, where when you get to early 1970s, or really mid-1970s, after the Watergate scandal, you see counterculture emerge as the dominant culture in America. So the 60s represent this transition that happened, where the prominent culture in the 1950s kind of took a backstage role as the counterculture became much more central in American politics in the 60s and 70s. And the early 1960s really, I think, is the start of the transition of that happening in America. So the Kennedy presidency really marks, I think, the end of this era of post-war prosperity, where you see America becoming much more divided, much more division in America following the Kennedy administration. And yeah, I think this book really highlights how the early 60s really is the start of that transition in America. And this book also talks a great deal about the civil rights movement in America during the early 1960s. I really like the way this book presents the civil rights movement, because it talks about how the civil rights movement was part of a much broader movement happening across the whole world. Because the 1950s, 1960s was really the era of decolonization, where all these countries in Africa and Asia were throwing off their colonial rulers. And you saw people all over the world pushing back against imperialism. And the United States wasn't an imperial power in the way that Britain or France were, but they still were, in a sense, very much an imperial power. But a lot of the colonization in America happened internally. I've heard people say before that America is really a nation of colonized peoples, looking at African Americans who were brought here as slaves and really subject to the worst of imperialism during that time period, American slavery. So this movement of throwing off the imperialists and colonial powers was happening internally in America. And a lot of people in the civil rights movement, a lot of leaders, were in contact with people in different movements happening around the world where nations are throwing off their imperialist rulers. So this book definitely presents the civil rights movement as part of a much broader movement happening all around the world during this time period. And I'm pretty familiar with the civil rights movement, but reading it in this book really refreshed me on a lot of the events of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And I was reminded how brutal white supremacy was in America during this time period, how much they fought back against what the civil rights movement was trying to do. This book talks about all the sit-ins that occurred, and talks about the Freedom Riders who they were trying to desegregate all these interstate buses in the South. And the way that people attack these buses and attack these protesters is really just it's shocking how brutal and how much violence happened during this time period. I think it really shows how powerful this movement of nonviolence was, because it really demonstrated what was happening to African Americans in this country and just how much violence and brutality was happening against them. And it's really shocking to read about. And the one event that I actually did not know too much about, really didn't know about at all, was the Old Miss riots of 1962. It was these riots at University of Mississippi, where there was a student that was going to University of Mississippi, and they were trying to desegregate universities during this time period. And the University of Mississippi had this huge riot where hundreds of people were injured, a couple of people were killed during these riots. And it just kind of shocked me how this happened in America, just reading about that. And Kennedy sent in the National Guard, he invoked the Insurrection Act to send federal troops into the University of Mississippi to stop these riots against this black student who was trying to go to the University of Mississippi. And this book talks about how this riot that happened in 1962 happened 100 years to the day after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln. So 100 years ago, when this event was happening, this riot, slaves were just freed in the United States. So it's just crazy to think that, 100 years later, we were still fighting over this issue, fighting over African Americans becoming an integrated part into our country. And it's just shocking to hear about how much violence and hatred there was back then. And we're still seeing elements of this today. I'm not going to get into what's happening in the world today. That's a whole other video. But sometimes it's just sad to see how much just hatred there is for what? Like, why do people have to hate each other so much? Like, can't we just live together and get along? But yeah, this book definitely focuses on how Kennedy was really the first American president to be an active part of the civil rights movement, to actively work with civil rights movements or civil rights leaders to try to have some kind of change in America. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 obviously didn't occur during Kennedy's presidency, because he was assassinated in 1963. But LBJ was able to really use the memory of Kennedy's assassination to help push this act through Congress in 1964. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is definitely a testament to Kennedy, a testament to things that he did during his presidency to try to improve civil rights in America. And I also found it interesting in this book, it talks a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. and how Kennedy had tried to work with him to help civil rights in America. But the FBI had so many wiretaps on MLK's phones. They really spied on him to really figure out what he was doing, because he was someone that Kennedy wanted to work with, so they wanted to know as much as they could about him. And MLK had a lot of communist connections. He wasn't himself a communist, but there were a lot of people that he worked with very closely who were known to be communists. And Kennedy and the FBI really stopped MLK from having those connections. He really told him, you have to stop talking to communists if you want us to help you. If you want the civil rights movement to succeed, you have to cut your ties with all these communists. So just kind of shocking to see how the FBI was wiretapping MLK during this time period. But this book talks about how the civil rights movement was really an emerging thing during this time period, and how Kennedy was definitely essential in having all this change happen in looking at civil rights in America during the 1960s. And after looking at the civil rights movement, this book talks a little bit about just changing values in general in America during the early 1960s, because the 1950s definitely an era of a lot of conformity, a lot of traditional American values. And this book looks into, in particular, about how 1950s were very harmful to women, because during 1950s, women were, seen as people that needed to stay in the household. They were told to buy certain household products, stay at home and raise families. And women really didn't have any identity outside the household during this time period. They really just told that they had to fully live their lives at home. They really were trapped in suburbia, because suburbia was a very nice place to raise a family, but they were very isolated, very cut off from major cities, and it was just a very isolating place. When I think back on my own family, my grandparents, who were my grandmothers, who were women during the 1950s, who were housewives during the 1950s, and in my lifetime, I remember them having a lot of anxiety, and I think a lot of that anxiety that housewives had during the 1950s came from just being so isolated and being so trapped in the household, being told by pop culture that they had to have no identity outside of being a housewife. I think that was very just isolating. It made them have very unfulfilled lives during the 1950s, and I think definitely there's a lot of impacts of that for decades and decades to come after the 1950s. But this book really explains how the second wave feminist movement that really took off during the 1960s has its roots in the 1950s. It has its roots in the way women were treated in the 1950s. And it's just interesting to see how harmful the 1950s were. The 1950s are really, I think, seen by a lot of people as this the golden age of in America, the suburban lifestyle that existed during that time period. But it was really a harmful time period in a lot of ways to women and just, I think, society in general during this time. And this book also talks about how a lot of the norms that were changing in America weren't just civil rights and women's rights. It was also the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hold that was on power in America was starting to unravel, because Kennedy was Catholic, and Kennedy being a Catholic was seen as this as this outrageous thing during that time period. It's just weird to think about that. Being Catholic was seen as something that was outrageous for a president during the time period, but it represents norms changing, how WASPs were losing their grip on power in America, and things were starting to change. And you see that in Kennedy. And Kennedy is just really, I think, a good example of so many changes in America. Just how America was being more youth-oriented, how he was a Catholic, that WASP grip on power was really starting to unravel. It just, in very subtle ways, he represents so much change that was happening in America during this time period. And this book talks about how the 1950s were a very religious time period, how religion was seen as, I think, a reaction to a lot of the horrors of World War II, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and mostly against communism. Just seeing people who wanted to see America as this Christian nation, in opposed to communists, these anti-religious communists. They wanted to see themselves as separate from that. So that really, I think, pushed for a lot of religious movements in America during the 1950s. And this is when the Pledge of Allegiance added "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" was added to coins during this time period. So you can see how America was so religious oriented during the 1950s. And I think the most interesting part of this book is when it looks at the origins of counterculture in the 1960s. It talks about how counterculture had its roots in the 1950s with things like the Beat Generation. But a lot of the radicals in the 1950s, they stayed in place. They kind of just kept to themselves. The Beats in particular, they didn't really try to change society. They just kind of kept themselves, had their ideas, and just stayed within their subcultures. But in the 1960s, you start to see these radicals move around the country, start to break a lot of the conventions that existed in America in the 1950s. So the 1960s is where you start to see a lot of seeds that were planted in the 50s when it came to subculture and counterculture starting to take off and starting to finally change American culture. And this book talks about how, I like how he says that, this book talks about how the 1950s were seen as the great American barbecue. And this author says that the Beats were the whiny crackpots at America's great barbecue. So the Beats didn't really change anything in the 50s. They were just people who complained about how messed up the world was. And talks about how the poem "Howl" by Allen Ginsberg really represents all of the anxieties and fears that the Beats had when it came to how they saw themselves fitting into culture in America. So "Howl" was really this moment where, when Allen Ginsberg read this poem at this Sixth Gallery reading in 1955, it was really a moment where the Beats were finally on the map, and people were starting to hear about, on a much larger scale, what was happening with these different cultures that were emerging in America. And when Jack Kerouac published On the Road in 1957, that was a real moment, the real watershed moment where the Beats started to enter popular culture. People were very much aware of the Beat generation. But this book talks about how Kerouac, he was a writer who obviously sold books, but what he really sold to America was opening coffee shops and selling Levi jeans. So he really, On the Road came out during a very consumeristic time period, even though Jack Kerouac and the Beats were very much not aligned with consumerism at that time period. They were really an idea that was capitalized on by pop culture in America. So Kerouac and Beat Generation are very much, I think, the way that they became so popular, a product of consumerism. Because people flocked to Greenwich Village and North Beach in San Francisco. They just flocked to all these emerging beat subcultures in America. So it's just interesting to see how America during this time period is really primed to, pull all of these beat figures into pop culture. So I think, like I said before, even though the Beats were really against pop culture, they became pop culture in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And the Beats became known as the Beatniks, which got its name from Sputnik, which is very interesting because Sputnik was seen as something that was very subversive to America, seen as something that was very scary and dangerous. So when people started calling the Beats Beatniks, it was really identifying that as this subversive thing in America during this time period. I think the Beats really, they didn't really take that much of an active role at the time in changing America, but they really, I think, foreshadowed a lot of the dismantling of America's social and political order of the 1950s. But I think that the Beats represent something much broader happening because in the late 1950s, early 1960s, the Beat generation is very much a subculture. It wasn't like a beat counterculture that overtook the whole nation. It was very much a subculture. Even though it entered popular culture, it was still very much a subculture. But I think the Beats really planted the seeds of contemporary American culture. A lot of where America went during the 1960s has its origins in a lot of the ideas of the Beat generation. But the Beat generation, I think, is really a symptom of something much broader happening in America during the 1950s. Because during World War II, a lot of artists came to America. A lot of artists fled France, fled Paris after the Nazis came into France during World War II. A lot of expressionists and Dadaists and surrealists, they all came to America and brought their art to America. And they really inspired America because America was a very disillusioned place following World War II. There's a lot of disillusion from the atomic bomb and the Holocaust and World War II in general. And artists were very inspired by, groups of people like the surrealists. And that's when you have abstract expressionism really come into the scene during the 1950s. People like Jackson Pollock really were just changing the form of what art could be. These very abstract, just messy looking paintings just symbolize the destruction of the atomic bomb and just really highlighted a lot of disillusionment in America. But the abstract expressionists, what they did with art weren't so much different from what was happening in writing and music, because bebop musicians, it took jazz and made it this very abstract thing, which is a lot of random notes and noise. And it's not so different than abstract expressionism when you really think about it. And spontaneous prose is the writing style of Jack Kerouac, which is also very sporadic and random. And it really just does a lot of the same things that abstract expressionism and bebop does. And all these artists, these different types of art forms, all the artists, they all knew each other in New York City, especially around Greenwich Village. They all lived around that area. So New York City was a place where a lot of ideas were spreading, a lot of abstract ideas were taking hold on art. And the folk revival happened during this time period. People like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were really taking a lot of the ideas that were expressed by beat writers and putting them into music form and singing about America and a lot of discontent people had for what was happening during America during this time period. And they really, I think the folk revival highlights a lot of that in their music. So you really see that this was all part of postmodern art. The postmodern art movement was taking off during this time period. The postmodern art music, the postmodern art movement had its origins in this discontent in the 1950s. And I think this book talks a little bit about it, but I kind of had my own thoughts after reading it. But culture is really a language. Culture is a language. And I think during this time period, a new language is starting to emerge as a new culture emerged. And postmodern art was really the language of this emerging culture, of this emerging counterculture. They all spoke in this postmodern art language. A lot of the ideas are really, I think, where the counterculture has its origins in the 1960s. But I think what the Beat Generation and postmodern art in general really represents, it represents people flocking to different ideas during the 1950s. Because 1950s were an era of conservatism and religious values, and people were flocking to those ideas because they were afraid of what was going on in the world, afraid of communism. But postmodern art really represents people flocking towards ideas that were contrary to these conservative values in America. And even though America, people were flocking to different ideas, flocking to ideas that were against conservative values, America was still a very consumeristic nation. We're becoming much more consumeristic. As we went into the 1960s, consumerism was still very much a part of people's lives in America. And art really was reflective of that, because I think the biggest artist that really changed art was Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol represented that link in development of art, stretching back to abstract expressionism, where America really was becoming much more aware of consumerism. And Andy Warhol, in his pop art, really mocked consumerism. He really took a lot of consumeristic images and turned them into art. Because America was living in this world of consumerism. So it made sense that art was going to be influenced by this era of consumerism. And Andy Warhol really represented that moment where I think art really, changed, and people were much more aware of art. Art became much more a central part in culture during this time period. And as this book talks about how postmodern art really started to change America during this time period, it talks about how the real revolution of postmodern art, or the postmodern art mindset, or the language of postmodern art, wasn't so much in the art. It was in drugs. Things like LSD are really what I think, or this book describes as what really brought postmodern art to the masses. Because drugs like LSD represented changing the way that people thought and the way people saw the world. And that's the same thing that art tried to do. So in the same way that images and words really can transform a society, drugs really did the same thing during the 1960s. Psychedelic drugs were really this tool that people used to try to change the way that they saw the world. So this mindset developed with postmodern art. When postmodern art entered pop culture and people started to look at things in very abstract and spontaneous and different ways, drugs like LSD were really the apex of that changing mindset in America during the 1960s. And as this book talks about drugs like LSD becoming a part of culture in America during the 1960s, it really highlights the writer Aldous Huxley as a central person in bringing LSD into America during this time period. Because Aldous Huxley, after his experience with psychedelics, I believe he took peyote during the early 1960s, and eventually he used drugs like LSD. He gave LSD to artists and writers and philosophers and really tried to change the way that people thought when he gave them drugs. And Aldous Huxley really developed this circle of people who were using drugs like LSD. And this circle of people grew to include people like Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, Ram Dass. So a lot of the major thinkers, writers, philosophers of the late 1950s, early 1960s were people that Aldous Huxley gave LSD to. So he was really trying to experiment, trying to see how, if all these great minds took LSD, how it would change them, how it would change the way that they saw the world. And this author, I think there's a couple errors in the way that he describes different links in people meeting each other and this circle of LSD users expanding. But regardless, there's this growing circle of LSD users, different artists and philosophers who are using it. But eventually, the circle of people grew to include Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary is really the most central person in LSD use in the 1960s in America. And originally, Timothy Leary tried to create this community of LSD users where they could study LSD in Mexico, but it didn't work out there. So eventually he went to this place called the Millbrook Estate in upstate New York, outside New York City. At the Millbrook Estate, he gave LSD to a lot of artists, but mainly gave it to elite people. All the elites in America who he gave LSD to. It was just a lot of ritzy people who came to Timothy Leary. And it was really trying to make this, all these, like, I guess you could call it like high priests of LSD, where they wanted to have all these elite people using LSD, and these elites could change society. But regardless, Timothy Leary was much more interested in giving LSD to people who were elites, and not so much giving it to just the masses, because he didn't think that the masses of people would be able to handle the effects of LSD on the human mind. But the person who was responsible for bringing LSD to just the masses of people in America was Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey was really the opposite of Timothy Leary in the way that Timothy Leary was giving LSD to elites, but Ken Kesey gave LSD to just everyday people, just to see how it would affect them, how it would change the way people saw the world. So you definitely see how LSD was emerging in the early 1960s. Obviously, it didn't take off in the early 1960s, not until in the mid 1960s, where you really see the counterculture movement becoming much more associated with psychedelic culture. But in the early 1960s, when this book takes place, you're just looking at really the origins of that and how these people were starting to gather in America, and just the origins of psychedelic use in America in the 1960s. And there's one fact this book brings up that I find very interesting about Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley died on November 22nd, 1963. The day that JFK was assassinated, Aldous Huxley died. And Huxley is really one of the founding fathers of psychedelic drug use in America, which is such a prominent theme of the 1960s. And the fact that he died on the day JFK died really just represents, I think, this end of an era in the early 1960s and this beginning of a new era. Not only did Huxley die on the day JFK died, but as he was on his deathbed, he asked his wife to administer him LSD. So when JFK was assassinated, Aldous Huxley was laying in bed dying on LSD. So it really just cements 1963, 1964 as really this cutoff in the early 1960s where everything changed after that. And I think, yeah, it just is weird just that Aldous Huxley died and saying that JFK was assassinated. It just represents this era coming to an end. But this book ends by talking about the JFK assassination. And I mean, obviously, I knew the JFK assassination was a very big deal in American history, but this book really emphasizes how much JFK's assassination really shocked the world. People were really just horrified by what happened, because Kennedy was this person of promise, this person of hope in not just America, but in the world. The fact that he was killed just really shocked people and hurt people, and people were really changed by the Kennedy assassination. And I think a lot of that horror and fear and anxiety that came along with that really, I think, influenced the 60s, really influenced the culture of the 60s and people's mindset during this time period, and just really established the 60s as a very tumultuous time period, a very violent time period with a lot of change. And I think Kennedy's assassination just highlights how turbulent the 60s were really going to be. And this book talks about how the Kennedy assassination was such a visible thing on TV. Like, if you turn on the TV in the days after Kennedy was assassinated, all you could see was clips of Kennedy being shot, just talking about what had happened, and it was a very televised event. And it's also very representative of Kennedy himself, because Kennedy, his campaign was the first fully televised presidential campaign, and his assassination was so televised. So his whole presidency was just defined by television. And it's just interesting to just think about it all, and just think about how much of a time period of change the early 1960s was, and how it represents really, I think, all that was to come in the 1960s. But yeah, a really great book. Kennedy, The Promise of the 60s, really was a great introduction to the 60s. It just kind of shows you what was at stake in the early 1960s, how the 50s transitioned into the 60s, and just really foreshadowed what a turbulent decade the 60s was going to be. So I really recommend this book if you want to learn about the 1960s, if you want an introduction book to kind of kick off your learning about the 1960s. This book is definitely the book that highlights all of the major things that are going on in America during this time period, and it's just a really great book. So yeah, be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.